Welcome to Health and Veritas. I'm Harlan Krumholtz.
And I'm Howie Foreman. We're physicians and professors at Yale University. We're trying to get closer to the truth about health and healthcare. Our guest today is Dr. Anna Reisman. But first, we always like to check in on hot topics in health and healthcare. And Harlan, what do you have?
Thanks, Howie. There's a lot going on that we could talk about. I wanted to just take a minute to talk about this long COVID definition that just came out of the National Academy of Medicine. As you know, I've been working on long COVID with Akiko Iwasaki and been doing a wide variety of things. So I've been watching this pretty carefully. I'm just curious what you think. So, this just comes out. Here's how they started. The rationale. Why did the National Academy of Medicine, funded by the federal government, spend all this time, actually almost a year, they've been working on this? And the National Academy of Medicine is a group that's not governmental, but does a lot of work for the government, brings together leading experts, and they serve a convening function. So they're often bringing people together, discussing an issue, and coming out with a report like this. And, it's frustrating sometimes because you see a lot of effort put into something. And then the question is, at the end of the day, is it advancing us? So this was the rationale. The lack of a consistent definition for long COVID presents challenges for policymakers, researchers, public health professionals, clinicians, support services, and patients. And then they said, so this lack of a definition is a problem because
it is.
Right. So, well, there is a definition. WHO's got a definition.
Right.
And CDC's had a definition, but now the National Academy was going to weigh in. Here's the definition that they came up with. Long COVID is an infection-associated chronic condition that occurs after SARS-CoV-2 infection and is present for at least 3 months as a continuous, relapsing, and remitting or progressive disease state that affects one or more organ systems. Does that help you?
Well, it helps me in terms of knowing that we're using 3 months as the figure. I think at times earlier on, people were using 6 months. I mean, there have been various things that people have used loosely. And, I'm not a clinician who takes care of these patients, but we're going to get to a point where people are going to want to, document even ICD-10 codes about whether you do or do not have something.
Here's my just point is that, we've had these definitions. Now this group spends a year.
Yeah.
Look, they say here are the components: attribution to infection, no laboratory confirmation or other proof of initial infection is required. Onset must be present for at least 3 months. Okay. But can be continuous from or delayed in the onset. So it can occur at the same time or later. More than 200 symptoms are part of this, can affect one or more organ systems. Equity can affect children and adults, can affect everyone, regardless of health.
So your concern is that it's too broad and it doesn't really narrow things down.
I think it probably is that it's too early. Like, we need science. So there's no taxonomy here. There's no classification system. They're basically just saying it lasts for 3 months. You don't need to even demonstrate prior infection, which I agree with. But it's like, I just don't know how it helps us. And here's the thing. When you've got something so nonspecific, I don't know that it advances us.
So that's I understand. But for me, what I've understood long COVID to be is a post-viral syndrome that for the first time, because we had a singular wave of a novel virus that we got to witness, a large enough cohort that we actually can learn a lot about it.
I agree with it, but I'm just saying that this definition...
But what I'm saying is that there are millions of other people that have post-viral syndromes who have no idea whether it was a brief exposure to cytomegalovirus or Epstein-Barr virus, or even a cold virus that might have triggered this in them. And this is a moment where if we can define it somewhat narrowly, not too narrowly, that I think it starts to allow us to collect more information, not less, no?
Well, I'm just saying, so when you're doing studies or inclusion, what we needed, I think, was a bit of a taxonomy. Like, there are various different groups you can think of that would be worthy of study as individual groups. Here's the benefit of this statement, and we can just end it here because we have a lot to talk about today, that they are endorsing that it's real. That's great. I mean, CDC and WHO already had definitions, but there are many doubters. So the fact that they could endorse it, I think rather than coming up with a definition, they could have said, one, we are in complete consensus that there is a post-infectious syndrome here. And that what really makes a difference is that it lasts a while and it can include any system. It can
Yeah.
affect any person. It can be highly
Now,
disabling.
it makes sense.
And
Yeah.
what we need is now to start to create a taxonomy of disease, because putting everyone under this umbrella is including a heterogeneous group of people, likely with various different causes, underlying mechanisms, potential targets for diagnostic and therapeutic testing. And we need to get on with this understanding of this, not just as long COVID, but long COVID type 1, type 2, type 3,
Right.
type 4,
Right.
so that we can address it. And I don't want to criticize earnest, hardworking experts who are doing their best. But I'm just saying, in the end of the day, I don't think I'm any better off today than I was yesterday with regard to this. We need to roll up our sleeves, generate the science, and begin to define this in ways that are meaningful for patients, that allow us to target what's underlying the causes are. That's what we're hoping to do. That's why I'm working with Akiko. I'm hoping that what she's going to be revealed in the lab, what we're going to be able to reveal in clinical research, helps us understand what should we be targeting in whom. A very more precision approach than just saying there's long COVID and it's everything, you know. Anyway, that's my hope. Anyway, let's get on to Anna Reisman. I just want to share that. I don't want to sound so negative, but I'm just frustrated
Understood.
still that we're not making the progress.
Dr. Anna Reisman is professor of medicine and the director of both the program for Humanities in Medicine and the Internal Medicine Residency Writers Workshop at the Yale School of Medicine. In these roles, she works to bring awareness to the narratives about patients, institutions, and care that are woven into the practice of medicine. Dr. Reisman is also a co-director of Yale School of Medicine's Committee for Art in Public Spaces, which we'll get to a little later in our discussion. Additionally, her writing has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post, among many other medical and non-medical publications. Dr. Reisman holds a Bachelor of Arts in English from Yale and an MD from NYU School of Medicine. She completed her internship and residency at NYU Medical Center and Bellevue Hospital, where she also served as chief resident. So first of all, I want to welcome you to the podcast. And I will say up front that what prompted having you on now rather than at some other time was a piece that you wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine. We're going to get to that, a specific piece. But I want to just start off because it still is a relatively unusual path for someone to be an English major and go on to become a physician and a practicing physician in particular. Can you tell us what your journey was like? Where did you grow up and when did you first become interested in medicine?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you so much, Howie Harlan, for having me on. So I was born in Yale New Haven Hospital. And yeah, so I grew up in Hamden, went to school
Your parents
here.
were professors here, I believe?
My dad was a law school professor, and my mom worked as a psychiatric social worker. But yeah, so we grew up in the Springland section of Hamden, and I went to Yale as an undergrad, as you mentioned. I was an English major and didn't think about science at all, science or medicine at all. I was happy not to take science classes.
I do want to say one thing. English at Yale is the hardest major. You know, the English department at Yale is world renowned.
Yes.
And actually, that is just such a hard major because it's just such an emphasis on critical thinking and writing and analysis, right?
I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. To me, like any science major would have been much, much harder and much more unpleasant. So, but I guess the summer before senior year, read The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, and there's just a lot of focus on tuberculosis and history of medicine, and it just kind of opened up this whole world that I had been ignoring. And so I took freshman biology as a senior, which was fantastic, and decided that I needed to do a post-bac, was not interested in grad school or anything else at that point. So I moved to New York, signed up for the Columbia post-bac program, worked in a bunch of jobs at the same time. I worked in a lab at Mount Sinai. Anyway, so somewhere along those lines, I decided to, I started thinking more about medicine. And here I am.
And did you immediately, upon graduating or starting medical school or whenever, decide that you were going to incorporate writing into your career, or was that something that came to you a little later? And then I'll let Harlan speak. Sorry.
I mean, I always loved writing and journaling, and I found in medical school pretty once I started my clinical rotations, I needed to write in order to kind of just get stuff down that I didn't have time to think about. That was kind of overwhelming in the moment. So I didn't really know about combining a career. I read people like Richard Selzer and Lewis Thomas and Oliver Sacks and thought, oh, these are really cool. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to somehow combine them? But I wasn't really sure how to do that early on.
I wanted to explore a little bit this piece you wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's so important for us to think about the people who are not well seen within medicine, meaning the patients who don't get the attention. Gretchen Berland did a fabulous film on people in wheelchairs, that sort of, I think, opened a view called Rolling. They opened a view on what their view of life is and how maybe we don't really see their needs and understand them well within the healthcare environments. You were opening a view on people with intellectual disabilities, and this happened to be something that was very personal to you and in a very powerful piece that I highly recommend to anyone who's listening, and we'll put a link to it in the notes. But maybe you can just start by telling us a little bit about your sister before we get to the what you really wrote about, which was her confrontation of an illness.
Sure.
But can you tell us a little bit about Deborah?
Yes. So Deborah was my younger sister. She died about 10 years ago. And she had a disease called tuberous sclerosis, which in her case meant that she was severely intellectually disabled, nonverbal, autistic, and had epilepsy as well. It was difficult for my parents to raise her for a lot of reasons, and she moved to a residential school when she was about 10, and when she was 21, she moved to a group home in Brantford, and that's where she lived for the last 25 years of her life.
So can you just tell a little bit about the story that you wrote about? I mean, what happened?
Sure. So my sister was diagnosed with breast cancer, and basically, I write about how each step of the way was much more difficult than it should have been because of her intellectual disability, her inability to understand what was going on. So even from the diagnosis of finding the lump, she wouldn't understand to stay still and have a breast exam. I mean, she would kind of get up and try to walk away from the examiner. At first I thought it's breast cancer. It's probably early. She's otherwise, fairly healthy, and it should be able to be straight. I didn't anticipate all of these problems, but then as soon as we sat down with the team of surgeons and oncologists, it became painfully clear that each mode of treatment had so many potential problems, and that the standard of care was really going to be difficult, if not impossible.
We had Tara Legou on the podcast probably a year ago talking about healthcare for the disabled. We don't serve these populations well, but we also don't do the types of research that might inform decision making for these patient populations. Part of it has to do with biomedical ethics and even getting informed consent on these individuals. But you make some recommendations in that piece about how we could at least do better and be better. Do you want to just reflect on that? And it ties in so much with what Harlan has taught me over the years as well.
Sure. One person I spoke to who was a specialist in neurodevelopmental disorders for children and adults, which is very unusual, she had suggested a doula for situations like my sister's, and somebody who would be trained in spending time with people who are nonverbal, who might not understand what's going on, and connecting, being kind of that connection between them and the family and the healthcare providers. So I thought that was a wonderful idea. And then the other thing I kind of emphasized in that article was just how pediatric oncology is just kind of a different world. And like so much of pediatrics, it's a kinder and gentler world where people are seen more. And I think they also have, pediatrics generally has more experience with people with intellectual disabilities. That's where kind of the focus is. And a lot of them continue with their pediatricians into adulthood just because few adult doctors are trained. So,
It, I think this whole topic is one in which, hits on this fact that sort of we're taught about idealized patients in sort of verticals. Like, here, let's teach about cardiovascular disease. Let's teach about GI disease. Let's teach about, allergen immunology. I remember one of the most challenging patients I ever had mental health issues. So he came in with valve disease that was sure to kill him if he didn't have surgery. And we couldn't get him to the consent. He wasn't, in a position where you would take away his ability to decide about his body, and his ability to cooperate with the recovery was at question because of his mental illness. And so in the end, the heart disease became threatening because we couldn't follow the standard of care. But standard of care exists in a vacuum, as if it's sort of an idealized individual who doesn't have anything else but that problem. And I thought one of the fascinating things you did was, I can look in a textbook and there is a section on what they call special populations, which really, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean that they're not very common. It's just like thinking that there are people who have something else that might layer on top of the problem this textbook chapter is talking about, so that you might have different considerations, but it's very thin. There's not, as Howie's suggesting, much research on it. And we're poorly equipped as physicians. We've never been trained. Our medical schools aren't replete with how we even process this. We're not equipped to handle slow, like we should be. We're a medical system. Most people have to move slowly who are, dealing with physical issues. But for us, we got 10 minutes of this appointment. Get them in, get them out. It's like we're at a fast clip, and that's not how many people are working. Do you see a path forward both in education and in the way in which we set up our structures so that we are better accommodating this? Because we're interested in throughput right now in healthcare. This is all about RVU accumulation, relative value units. How many patients can you see in an hour? I mean, we're being judged as our productivity by how many people we're seeing. And yet our patients have very different needs, and we're not given the space or credit when we're handling people who are difficult. A patient like your sister may take an hour or two in order really to manage properly. And there's no space for that. I mean, how are we going to deal with that?
My sister she lived in a group home in Brantford, and we found a concierge doctor who took care of a lot of people with intellectual disabilities. And it was great. She knew how to do it. She would make house calls. Sometimes appointments were not rushed. And so we need more people like that who have the experience.
I want to make sure that we have time to talk about three related topics. One is your leadership in the Humanities and Medicine program. The second is your leadership in the writing program that you've worked both locally as well as with the VA Boston. And I also want to make sure we talk about the program for art in public spaces at Yale. So, and feel free to touch on whichever one is most.
Well, I'm going to say my preference, because we're not going to get to all this, but she's been doing this inventory of, what art is on the walls at Yale and what is it projecting about these portraits. And can you just tell us a little bit about that project and where it's going?
Yeah, I was hoping you would choose that one. So this project started in 2018 or 19, and it really was generated by students who had put together some demands. And one of the demands was to reassess what was on the walls and to specifically look at the historical portraits. And these dude walls that Rachel Maddow named, which are at so many academic institutions, and you just have walls and walls of old white men in oil paintings. And so Yale has that in its flagship building at the medical school. And they've just been up there for a long time gathering dust. Nobody was really keeping track of who they were. There were no labels. So other than the 13 or 14 deans, there were another 40 or so portraits. And we didn't really know who they were. Maybe their name was on it. Not all of them. And so the then Dean Alpern, put together this committee and asked us to figure out who these people were and why they were on the walls.
Who in the heck have we got on the walls?
Right. I mean, it seems so absurd that we wouldn't know, but we didn't know.
Yeah.
And so we hired. This was during COVID, and the first summer of COVID, and we hired some history of medicine graduate students and history of art graduate students, and they did a lot of research into figuring out, getting some background information on the dudes, and they found all kinds of interesting things. So many of them, not the deans, but so many of the other ones, really had a very loose connection to the medical school. That a lot of these were put on the wall for the centenary of the school in 1913 or something like that. And so I just picture people going up to their attics and, oh, here's like dusting off like yeah, didn't Uncle Joe or Grandpa or whatever have some connection to Yale Medical School? And so they just kind of decorated the walls, and they've been for decades, which is absurd.
Did you find anyone who you said had some sordid?
Yeah, so of course we were also looking to see if they had things that might not be so palatable these days. And there was one dean named Stanford Hope Baines from the 1930s. Stanford Baines Jones. Anyway, his portrait used to be immediately to the left of the dean's office if you were facing the dean's office. So you probably both walked by it thousands of times, and you probably never noticed what I'm going to tell you, which is that if you look very carefully, there are books painted in, and one of the books is a history of the Confederate States.
Gosh.
Which is just like, what? And and he did have a connection. His grandfather was in the slave trade, and he clearly also, had certain thoughts on that he chose for that book to be there. So that's interesting. So anyway.
And so what did you do? Do anything? Yeah. You painted it over?
Right. I took a Sharpie and went like this. No. So now the portraits have been moved down the hall. They're spread out a little bit more. We have the labels that have contextualizing information. So it's there. So we have the information there for people to see and to understand.
And we're celebrating women more now. We've got a whole hall celebrating women, right? You've made differences like this. You said this has to be more
right. So kind of perpendicular. The perpendicular hallway to where the deans are and the other people is now filled with beautiful, colorful photographs of women faculty. And they really you walk down that hallway and it's a very different feeling. You feel like they're saying, and hey, welcome.
And a portrait that celebrates our friend and colleague, Margie Rosenthal, who, tragically died several years ago. But that is in a major public space that I think is also a triumph to be able to have someone like that.
I want to tie it back to Margie a little bit, just as a final discussion point, and that is that the writers' workshop that you have led and collaborated with, and I think at times co-led, that is an incredibly productive activity at Yale. As Harlan said, there's a very robust history at Yale of physician authors. We've had several of them on the podcast. But this is not just the Shep Newlands of the world or the Seltzers or whatever, or the Anna Reismans. These are people who are writing their first op-ed, who are writing their first short story, or in the case of Marjorie, people who basically narrated their own disease and how it affected them and their family in their final years. Do you want to just say a few words about how important that is to the culture of Yale as a medical school?
Sure. So we just celebrated our 20th year of the Writers' Workshop, and so as you alluded to, we take people who are either experienced writers or who have no experience but just want to learn the basics of writing. And in medicine, kind of like what I was saying earlier on when I was talking about how I got here, we carry so many stories within us. There's so much potential to get our voices out there, and yet without some sort of knowledge of how to write, remedial writing, we just carry these stories and they don't go anywhere and they don't do anyone any good. And so it's really, I think it's incredibly important to provide these different ways, either through personal essays or op-eds and opinion pieces, through reflective writing. It's kind of like a smorgasbord, and people can pick what they're comfortable with and just take it from there. Like just getting thoughts down on paper. Reflective writing is kind of the first step towards publishing. And some people just want to reflect and think and use that as a way to kind of decompress. And other people will take it to the next level and get it out there to the public where it can affect change. So it's all good.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for sharing a lot of personal stories and the contributions that you're making to medical school. And it's wonderful to call you friend and colleague.
Thank you so much.
We really appreciate you.
Well, that was a great interview. Wow.
She is awesome.
Lots of good stuff in there. But now let's get to my favorite part of the podcast. Yeah. What's on your mind this week, Howie?
Yes, it's only been a few weeks since we last talked about H5N1 bird flu, but there's been just enough new info that I think it's really worth updating our listeners. And while we've been taping this, the World Health Organization actually just tweeted out even more updates that are related. So first, it's important to understand what would really change everything and start to make this a big news story. That would be human-to-human transmission, and particularly respiratory transmission. That would be a game changer. That'd be very concerning. We don't have that right now. This type of virus historically has been very lethal in humans through respiratory infection, but it's only gotten to humans via exposure to birds until recently. So now remember, these viruses are constantly mutating, and Darwinian selection drives them to achieve greater spread and more hosts. So it's not surprising that this is no longer just the bird flu. This has already made the jump from birds to cows, as we talked about, and other mammals. But to this point, most of the infections have been non-respiratory, or at least not dominating respiratory symptoms in the cows. And so far, it seems to be spread via the milking process in dairy farms. And until recently, 2 separate eye infections that likely came from contact spread were the first 2 human infections from this U.S. outbreak. But last month, first news story, last month we had our first human infected with respiratory symptoms, but that still likely came from a cow, and it was also not severe. And then we learned also just a week or so ago, a couple of weeks ago, that pasteurization, remember we talked about unpasteurized raw milk being potentially very dangerous. We just learned now that pasteurization is fairly effective at destroying the virus by an order of more than 10,000. So out of every 10,000 plus particles, only 1 survives pasteurization. And as you recall, this was our biggest concern, whether pasteurized milk supply was endangered. In the same study, by the way, they did show that raw milk can, in fact, infect mice, including respiratory symptoms, when taken orally. So this should be a concern to people, and I would still tell people no raw milk. Finally, what we learned just in the last week is through a controlled experiment using ferrets, and ferrets is the animal model most often used to study influenza, that 1, it is lethal in ferrets, whereas seasonal flu is not lethal in ferrets. And 2, it does not spread nearly as efficiently via respiratory droplets as seasonal flu does, so that's good. But it does spread efficiently through direct contact, which goes along with what we've been seeing with the cows. So this would seem overall good news, not terrible news. But the problem is it's constantly mutating, and there will be more mutations. And we are not tracking this closely enough to cut it off. And we do not know when it's going to become more infectious. What we do know is the number of herds and number of states in which this has infected cows has increased a lot over the last few weeks. We need to do much better surveillance testing in humans and cows. We need to accept that this will mutate. How fast and how infectious and how lethal remains to be seen. And we got to be careful to not be the next Wuhan. We've looked down at Wuhan and the Chinese for doing too little at the time they first became aware. We may be in the same position right now. I'm not looking to scare anybody, and I'm not saying we're going to have an outbreak this year or next, but I think it's getting closer than a lot of people are willing to admit.
Yeah, so Howie, I mean, what is really actionable here? So you start identifying some cows are infected. It's not really harming the cows right now, right? And you're not going to do what, like in China when they were doing the bird flu, they killed all those pigs. There were like millions of pigs that were killed. We're not going to kill the cows.
So we could be doing both polymerase testing as well as serology testing to find out who has antibodies. both in cows as well as in humans, to just figure out where it is. Because it is possible, Harlan, that there are people that are infected and we're just not finding them.
Yeah.
And it's possible that someone passes through a farm, has it, and does have respiratory symptoms. And if you remember the early part of even the pandemic in America, a lot of us, we didn't have tests available. A lot of us were like, maybe this person in the ICU who has this sudden onset of what looked like ARDS or adult respiratory distress syndrome, maybe that was COVID. And to this day, we don't even know the answer to that. We don't want to get caught on the late end of it, discovering that we have 2 or 3 patients at Yale New Haven Hospital that have it at a certain point.
I think you're just, and we can wrap this up, but you're raising, I think, to me, a bigger issue, which is we've just been through the pandemic and we have no national plan for how we manage infectious, outbreaks in the country. Like we have ways to go out for like singular things, but we don't have any sort of systemic way without, to manage this in the country. And everyone's just tired of talking about the pandemic. So instead of
farmers are afraid of this, and I understand that, but we've got to give them a reason not to be afraid of it.
Yeah. And we have an underfunded CDC, and we don't have much enthusiasm right now in developing strong surveillance system. It is a perfect storm for the next one, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for sharing that.
Thanks.
You've been listening to Health and Veritas with Harlan Krumholtz and Howie Foreman.
So how do we do? To give us your feedback or to keep the conversation going, email us at health.veritas@yale.edu or follow us on any of the many social media out there.
And we want to encourage you to give us feedback or send us questions, rate us on the podcast platforms. So we always read your reviews and it helps listeners find us.
And if you have questions about the MBA for Executives program at the Yale School of Management, reach out via email for more information or just check out our website at som.yale.edu/EMBA.
Health and Veritas is produced at the Yale School of Management, the Yale School of Public Health. Thanks to our researchers, Inez Gil and Sophia Stump, and to our producer, Miranda Schaefer. Extraordinary people. We're so lucky to work with you.
Very fortunate.
Talk to you soon, Howie.
Thanks very much, Harlan. Talk to you soon.